On the 15th of July, 1947, Britain opened a door it had promised to open, and the money started pouring out. Anyone in the world holding British pounds could now walk up and swap them for American dollars, and that is exactly what they did, faster and faster, day after day. Within a month, the Bank of England had lost around $1 billion it could not afford to lose. And a little over 5 weeks after that door swung open, Britain slammed it shut again, because if it hadn't, the country would have run completely dry. 5 weeks. That is how long it took to drain the reserves of the nation that had run the world's money for more than a century. But here's the part that turns this from a disaster into something darker. Britain didn't stumble into that door by accident. It had been forced to promise it, in writing, as the price of a loan it needed just to survive. And the men in Washington who wrote that condition and set the deadline had every reason to know what would happen when the clock ran out. The warnings were on the record. The arithmetic was sitting right there on the table. They set the date anyway. So let me show you how a single clause buried inside a loan agreement ended the reign of the British pound in about 5 weeks, and why the people who wrote it were not remotely surprised when it did. To understand how the most powerful empire in history ended up this helpless, you have to understand what winning the Second World War actually cost Britain, because Britain won, and winning nearly bankrupted it beyond repair. At the start of the war, Britain was still the banker of the world. For well over a century, the pound had been the currency everyone trusted. Global trade was priced in sterling. Countries held their national savings in sterling. If you were a merchant in Argentina or a government in Egypt, the pound was as good as gold because it could be swapped for gold on demand. London sat at the financial center of the planet. That was the position Britain held for generations, and then it spent 6 years throwing everything it had into a fight for survival. By 1944, more than half of the entire British economy was geared toward war production. Factories that had made goods to sell abroad were now making tanks and shells, and when you stop selling to the world and start making things to blow up, your income collapses. So Britain sold everything it could and borrowed the rest. It dumped the overseas investments it had spent a century accumulating, and when the assets ran low, it borrowed from the countries inside its own empire and trading network, buying food and materials from places like India and Egypt on credit, simply promising to pay them back later, in pounds. These IOUs piled up into enormous sums, and I need you to remember this number, because it becomes the murder weapon later. By the end of the war, Britain owed something like £3.5 billion in these debts, scattered around the world, and the single largest creditor was India, owed well over $1 billion on its own. Sit with how strange that is. The nation that had been the world's banker, the country everyone else owed, had completely flipped. Britain was now one of the largest debtors on earth. Its actual reserves of gold and dollars shrunk to a fraction of what it owed. On paper, the empire was still vast. In the bank account, it was running on fumes, and the only reason it hadn't already collapsed was a lifeline stretching across the Atlantic from the United States, called Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease had kept Britain alive and armed through the darkest years of the war. Starting in 1941, before America had even entered the fighting, the United States shipped Britain a torrent of supplies, food, fuel, weapons, ships, and the crucial thing was that Lend-Lease did not have to be paid back in the normal way. It was aid, given on the logic that helping Britain fight served America's own defense. As long as it flowed, Britain could keep importing what it needed without finding the dollars to pay. It was the safety net underneath the whole war effort, and in the late summer of 1945, with almost no warning, the Americans cut it. Japan surrendered in the middle of August, and the war was finally over. And just days later, President Truman signed the order that abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The tap that had supplied Britain for 4 years was shut off, almost overnight. There were even shiploads of goods already in transit that Britain was now suddenly expected to pay for. From the American side, there was a logic to it. The war was won, and Lend-Lease had always been a wartime measure. But from the British side, the timing was catastrophic, and it felt like betrayal. because Britain's problems did not end with the war. If anything, they got worse. Britain still had to help feed its colonies, ship coal to a shattered Europe, and occupy and govern an entire zone of defeated Germany, feeding millions of Germans. It had troops strung out across the globe. All of that cost dollars Britain didn't have. And on top of the overseas burden, the new Labour government under Clement Attlee had just been elected on a promise to build a whole new Britain at home. A national health service, public housing, a welfare state. The country that had just saved democracy in Europe had empty coffers and a to-do list a mile long. And here's a detail that makes what came next even crueler. The shape of the post-war money system had already been decided a year earlier at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There, in 1944, the Americans, holding most of the world's gold, had won the argument to put the dollar at the dead center of the global economy, with every other currency pegged to it. Britain's own negotiators had seen the danger coming and fought hard for one thing above all: time. A long transition period before they'd ever be forced to make the pound freely convertible, because they understood even then that convertibility was a loaded gun for a weakened Britain. Hold on to that, because within a year, the loan would rip that time away. The man who understood the depth of the hole better than anyone was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, and by now a very sick man. Keynes had a phrase for what Britain faced, designed to shake people. He called it a financial Dunkirk. He was saying Britain faced a disaster on the scale of that military catastrophe, except this time the enemy wasn't German tanks. It was insolvency. The country was about to run out of money to buy food, and there was only one place on earth with the dollars to save it. So Keynes, despite his failing heart, sailed to Washington. He carried a certain mood with him, and it explains why the next part felt like a slap. Keynes and most of Britain believed the Americans owed them something. Not charity, but justice. Britain had stood alone against Hitler before America joined the fight. British cities had been bombed. British soldiers had died for years before the first American troops arrived. So the decent thing, in British eyes, was for the United States to help its exhausted ally back to its feet with a gift, or at the very least, an interest-free loan. That is what Keynes expected. He was badly wrong. The men on the other side of the table weren't thinking about gratitude. They were thinking about business and about the future shape of the world. The key American negotiators were Fred Vinson, the Treasury Secretary, and Will Clayton, a senior State Department official who in private life ran the largest cotton trading business in the world. These were not sentimental men. They treated it like a hard commercial deal, because to them, that is what it was. The British team, expecting a warm conversation between allies, was so caught off guard they had shown up without even bringing a lawyer. And the Americans had a bigger agenda. For years, they had resented the way Britain ran its empire as a closed economic club, a system called imperial preference, where Britain and its colonies traded on special terms and kept outsiders, including American companies, at arm's length. To Washington, that closed system was an obstacle. They believed sincerely in many cases that free and open trade would make everyone richer and even help prevent the next war. And not coincidentally, that open world would be one where American industry and the American dollar dominated. So the Americans looked at Britain's desperation and saw an opportunity. Britain needed dollars badly enough to swallow almost anything, and they were going to use that to pry the whole system open. The negotiations dragged on for 3 brutal months, and they went badly almost from the start because Keynes had walked in with the wrong assumption. He genuinely believed he could reason and charm the Americans into a gift, that the sheer moral weight of Britain's sacrifice would move them. It didn't. Every time he cabled home that he thought he was close to a grant, reality would reassert itself, and the offer would turn back into a hard commercial loan with strings attached. Back in London, the cabinet grew alarmed, then furious, watching the telegrams arrive, watching the terms get worse and the conditions get heavier, realizing their star negotiator was being slowly backed into a corner. But the truth is, you cannot bluff when the other side knows you'll starve without the deal. The Americans knew Britain had nowhere else on earth to go, and they negotiated like men who held every card. The strain was literally killing Keynes. At one point during the ordeal, he suffered a heart attack. He kept working. And in December of 1945, out of options and out of time, Britain signed. Keynes had gone to Washington to win justice for his country and came home with a loan, a stack of humiliating conditions, and a body that was giving out. He would be dead within 4 months, in April of 1946, and he never lived to see the crisis his signature helped set in motion. Let me lay out what Britain got, and then what it had to give. What it got was a loan of $3.75 billion from the United States, plus a bit over $1 billion more from Canada. The terms looked almost kind. Just 2% interest, stretched over 50 years, with nothing to pay until 1951. If you only looked at the numbers, you could call it generous, but the loan came with conditions, and the conditions were the whole point. Britain had to start dismantling imperial preference and open its closed system. And towering over everything was one clause, the single most important sentence in the agreement. Britain had to make the pound freely convertible into dollars, and it had to do it within 1 year of the loan taking effect. Convertibility. That's the word that killed sterling. And I need you to understand exactly what it meant, because on the surface it sounds boring. Convertibility meant that anyone, anywhere, holding pounds they'd earned through trade, could bring them to Britain and swap them for American dollars, at a fixed rate, no questions asked. Now, why would people want dollars instead of pounds? Because in 1947, the United States was the only country on Earth that could actually supply what a wrecked world needed to rebuild. If you wanted machinery, or grain, or oil, you needed dollars to buy them from America. A pound could mostly only buy things from Britain, which still on rations didn't have much to sell, so a dollar was the hard, useful thing. A pound was a promise, and the moment you let people trade the promise for the hard thing, everyone was going to want to make that trade. And now, remember the murder weapon, the sterling balances. Those 3.5 billion pounds of wartime IOUs Britain owed to India, Egypt, and countries all over the world. As long as the pound was locked inside the British system, those IOUs were frozen in place. India might be owed over £1 billion, but it couldn't do much with them except slowly buy British goods. But convertibility changed everything. The instant sterling became convertible, every one of those pounds scattered around the globe turned into a claim on Britain's tiny stash of dollars. Picture it. Every country Britain had borrowed from during the war, all of them at once, could now line up at the window and demand to be paid in dollars instead of pounds. And Britain simply did not have the dollars to cover even a fraction of them. Its total reserves were maybe $2.5 billion. Against that, it faced many times more in claims that could come due the moment the door opened. The math was not close. It wasn't even a contest. It was a bathtub with the drain yanked wide open and a single garden hose trying to keep it full. And here is the detail that should make your jaw tighten. This danger was not a secret. The threat those sterling balances posed, the way convertibility would uncork them, was recognized during the loan negotiations themselves. Both sides sat at that table knowing the balances were a bomb, and they signed the agreement anyway, with the convertibility clause and its 1-year deadline intact, without ever diffusing it. And it wasn't just a few negotiators who understood. When the loan came back to Britain to be approved, the warnings were said out loud, in Parliament, a full year before the crisis hit. The debates were bitter, and they cut across party lines. Many politicians and ordinary people felt the whole thing was a national humiliation, being told by their closest ally to dismantle the economy of their empire and mortgage their independence, all for the crime of having spent themselves into ruin fighting the common enemy, largely alone in the early years. The labor left saw a surrender to American capitalism. The conservative imperialists were horrified at abandoning imperial preference. Even Winston Churchill could not bring himself to endorse it. And yet it passed, because underneath the anger, everyone understood the same grim fact. There was no alternative. Refuse the loan, and within months there would be no dollars to buy bread. You can vote your pride, or you can feed your people, but Britain could not do both. Still, the most chilling moment came in the Commons, where one member described exactly what was going to happen before it happened. He warned that the obligation to make sterling convertible within a year, an obligation there was no escape from, was bound to place a terrible strain on the country, and he painted it in words that turned out to be almost prophetic. He warned that while everyone was celebrating the goodies the loan would buy, they should keep their eyes on the moment, 1 year away, when Britain would take the first plunge into the icy sea of free convertibility. The icy sea. That was said in the summer of 1946. The plunge came in the summer of 1947, and the water was every bit as cold as he'd promised. So this raises the uncomfortable question. If the danger was this visible, then the Americans across the table knew it too. So why did Washington insist on that 1-year deadline? Why not give Britain 3 years, or 5, to rebuild before making it jump? The answer is that the convertibility clause wasn't a bug. It was the entire purpose. Washington wanted to break open the closed British system, end imperial preference, and knock the pound off its perch so the dollar could take its place. And convertibility did all of it at once. Forcing the pound to be freely swappable for dollars would shatter the walls of the sterling club and cement the dollar as the currency everyone actually wanted. The 1-year deadline wasn't an oversight. It was a demand, pressed by men like Vinson and Clayton over British pleas for more time, precisely because the sooner sterling was forced into the open, the sooner the old British order gave way to the new dollar won. Now, I want to be fair, because it would be too easy to paint this as a cartoon where Washington coldly plotted Britain's ruin. The real picture is more complicated. Plenty of Americans genuinely believed in free trade as a good in itself, having watched the closed trading blocs of the 1930s help drag the world into war. And the American Congress was deeply skeptical of lending money to Britain at all, especially to a new socialist government, so the harsh conditions were partly aimed at satisfying suspicious congressmen back home. The crisis, when it came, was also worsened by other things. A savage winter that crippled the economy, American inflation that quietly shrank the value of the loan, and Britain burning through the dollars fast on imports. So the convertibility clause was the trigger, but it was pulled in a room already full of gunpowder. And here's the twist that really complicates the villain story. When the crisis hit and Britain was bleeding out, it was actually the United States that agreed Britain could stop. Washington did not force Britain to keep the door open until it collapsed. Because by 1947, the Americans had a bigger fear, and it wasn't Britain. It was the Soviet Union. A total European financial collapse might push a starving, ruined continent toward communism, and Washington did not want that. So the goal was never to annihilate Britain. The goal was to break the old order and build a new one led by the dollar. Washington didn't necessarily want Britain destroyed. It just knew, when it wrote that deadline into the contract, that it was making a fragile, exhausted country jump into an icy sea on a fixed date, and it decided that cracking open the sterling system was worth the risk of Britain going under. And I want you to picture the state of the country that was about to jump, because it makes it harder to stomach. The Britain of 1947 was gray, exhausted, and in some ways hungrier than during the war itself. Rationing hadn't ended with victory. It had gotten worse. In 1946, the government did something it never had to do, even at the height of the fighting. It put bread on the ration. Bread, the most basic food there is, rationed in peacetime, in the nation that had just won the war. And then came the winter of 1946 into 47, one of the most savage in living memory. Snow buried the country for weeks. The coal ran short, power stations shut down, factories went dark, and millions sat shivering in freezing houses in the dark. This was the patient, and into that weakened body, the deadline injected the one thing guaranteed to finish it off. The date could not be moved because it was written into the contract, so the deadline stood. On the 15th of July, 1947, Britain took the plunge, and it happened astonishingly fast. The moment convertibility opened, the drain began. All those pounds sitting in accounts around the world flowed toward the Bank of England to be turned into dollars, and once converted, those dollars flowed straight out again, spent on American goods, gone from Britain's reserves forever. Every day the men at the bank watched the numbers, and every day the numbers were worse. In the first days it was a leak. Then it was a stream. Then it was something no one could pretend to control. In the month of July alone, according to Britain's own chancellor, the drain came to over $500 million from a country whose entire reserves were only a few billion. And it was speeding up, not slowing down. There was no bottom in sight, no natural point where the panic would exhaust itself, because everyone in the world who held a pound had exactly the same incentive at exactly the same moment. Get out. Turn the promise into dollars, while there were still dollars left to get. By August, it was a hemorrhage, running even faster than in July. Britain was now drawing down the American loan itself just to feed the drain, which is a staggering thing when you think about it. The very money Keynes had nearly died negotiating, the lifeline that was supposed to last for years, was being poured straight into the hole as fast as it came in, buying nothing, saving nothing, just slowing the bleed for another day. Within roughly a month of opening the door, the Bank of England had lost about $1 billion, and now the truly dangerous line was being crossed because the borrowed dollars were nearly gone, which meant Britain would soon have to start selling its actual gold, the last hard reserve, the bedrock the whole currency stood on. In mid-August, the gold started to move, and when a country starts shipping out its gold to stay afloat, everyone watching knows the end is close. At that point, the government knew it was over. This was no longer economic theory. It was a countdown to insolvency, measured in days. On Sunday the 17th of August, the cabinet met in emergency session, and the debate wasn't whether to stop convertibility anymore. Everyone understood it had to stop immediately, or the country was finished. The only question was how to break a solemn promise, written into a treaty with the United States without shattering the relationship and forfeiting the money they still had left. 3 days later, on the 20th of August, 1947, just over 5 weeks after the door had swung open, Britain suspended convertibility. It slammed the door shut. And look at the wreckage. In little over a month, the crisis had chewed through around $1 billion. Of the entire American loan, that $3.75 billion Keynes had nearly died for, only a few hundred million was left. The money meant to nurse Britain back to health over years had been blown through in weeks. Now, in the narrow sense, Britain survived. It stopped the bleeding and kept going. But something much bigger had just died, and it wasn't coming back. What died in those 5 weeks was the pound's reign as the money of the world. For more than a century, sterling had been the currency the whole planet trusted and used, the anchor of global trade and the store of the world's savings. It was the everyday proof that Britain sat at the center of the world. And what 1947 proved, in the most brutal and public way imaginable, was that the pound could no longer bear that weight. The nation behind it was too poor and too fragile to guarantee it. When Britain was forced to let people trade pounds for dollars, the world's verdict was instant and merciless. Almost nobody wanted to keep holding the pound. They wanted the dollar. And once that verdict was in, it could not be unsaid. 2 years later, Britain formally admitted it, devaluing the pound in one stroke by nearly a third. The dollar had been crowned on paper back at Bretton Woods. The sterling crisis of 1947 turned that coronation into a fact everyone could feel. And here is the final irony. What actually saved Britain from total collapse wasn't its own painfully negotiated loan, which it had just watched vanish down the drain. It was more American money. In 1948, the United States launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, and Britain became one of its largest recipients. Rescued again by American dollars on American terms, inside a system the Americans had designed. Sterling wouldn't be made properly convertible again until 1958, and by then, nobody was under any illusion about which currency ran the world. As for that original loan, Britain kept paying it off year after year, decade after decade. It made its final payment in December of 2006. 61 years after signing, Britain wrote the last check to Washington for the loan that had broken the pound. So when you strip it all down, here is what you're left with. A bankrupt Britain, having won the war, went to its wealthiest ally expecting a thank you and got a business contract instead. Inside that contract was a single condition, convertibility, on a 1-year fuse. Everyone at the table knew that fuse was lit. British politicians warned about the ICC out loud, a year in advance. The Americans set the deadline anyway, because forcing sterling open was exactly what they wanted, and they were willing to let a fragile ally take the risk to get it. The door opened on schedule, the reserves drained in 5 weeks, and the reign of the pound, more than a century old, was finished. Washington didn't need an army or a single shot to end it. It just needed a bankrupt debtor, a deadline, and a clause in a loan. And the proof isn't hidden in some vault. It's written right into the agreement, and the warnings are printed in the parliamentary record. It was all on paper the whole time. If this pulled back a curtain for you, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe, because it genuinely helps us keep digging into the quiet financial decisions that decided the fate of nations. And if you want to see the sequel, the moment less than a decade later when America used that same power over the pound to humiliate Britain on the world stage and end its days as a great power, go watch our video on the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Washington pulled the financial trigger and the British Empire finally folded. 1947 broke the pound. Suez broke the illusion. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.